A new decade began without ceremony. The year 1990 arrived in the United States without any noticeable sound. There were no nationwide pauses, no collective breath held, no shared moment where people stopped what they were doing to acknowledge that one decade had ended and another had begun. The calendar pages changed quietly, just as they always had, hanging on kitchen walls, resting on office desks, or flipping automatically inside small electronic clocks. January arrived in the same way it always did, bringing colder mornings in some places, mild winters in others, and the steady continuation of daily routines that had already been in place long before the number at the top of the calendar changed. Most people did not wake up on the first day of 1990 feeling any different. Alarm clocks rang at their usual times, coffee makers clicked on in dim kitchens, radios played familiar voices delivering weather forecasts and traffic updates that sounded no different from the week before. People dressed in the same clothes they had worn in late 1989, buttoning coats, tying shoes, checking mirrors without considering that a new decade had technically begun. The idea of the 1990s existed more as a printed label than as a lived experience. In offices across the country, employees arrived at their desks carrying briefcases and paper folders. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Computers booted up slowly, displaying simple screens and blinking cursors. Secretaries typed memos. Managers reviewed schedules. Meetings were held that felt identical to meetings from the previous year. The language of work did not change. Deadlines remained deadlines. Paperwork continued to accumulate. The transition into 1990 did not interrupt productivity, nor did it inspire reflection. It was simply another workday. Schools reopened after winter breaks with little mention of the decade changing. Students returned to classrooms where desks were arranged in the same rows, chalkboards still carried faint marks from lessons before the holidays, and textbooks remained unchanged. Teachers resumed lesson plans without adjusting their tone or expectations. Homework assignments were handed out. Attendance was taken. Bells rang at the same intervals. For most students, the concept of a new decade was abstract, something discussed briefly and then forgotten amid spelling tests and math problems. Outside, streets looked the same as they had in December. Cars moved through intersections at steady speeds. Traffic lights followed their predictable cycles. Pedestrians waited patiently at crosswalks, hands in pockets, minds focused on errands or obligations rather than historical transitions. Storefronts displayed clearance sales left over from the holiday season. Grocery stores restocked shelves. Shopping carts rolled down aisles filled with the same products people had purchased for years. At home, evenings passed quietly. Families ate dinners that followed familiar patterns. Television sets flickered on at expected hours, broadcasting scheduled programs that had already been advertised in newspapers and TV guides. Sitcoms, news programs, and commercials continued uninterrupted. The programming did not announce the decade with significance. It simply filled time, as it always had, providing background noise for conversations, meals, or moments of silence. The news itself did not sound new. Anchors read headlines with practiced voices. Stories unfolded slowly, often repeating themes from previous months. Political discussions continued in measured tones. International situations were explained with maps and careful phrasing. The sense of urgency was limited. Viewers listened, nodded, and moved on with their evenings. The beginning of 1990 did not demand attention. It blended into the ongoing flow of information. In many households, calendars were replaced out of habit rather than necessity. Old calendars were removed from walls and discarded without inspection. New ones were hung, often featuring landscapes, animals, or corporate logos. The dates were clean and unused, but the days ahead promised routines rather than surprises. Appointments were written in pencil or pen. Birthdays were circled. Work shifts were marked. The future appeared organized, predictable, and largely unchanged. Weekends arrived as expected. People ran errands, washed cars, mowed lawns where weather allowed, and visited familiar places. Shopping malls remained busy with slow-moving crowds, food courts filled with the same smells and sounds. Cashiers scanned items and made change, receipts printed steadily. There was no collective acknowledgement that a new decade had started. Time passed in increments measured by shopping trips and scheduled activities. Conversations rarely focused on the year itself. When 1990 was mentioned, it was usually in practical contexts, writing the date correctly on checks, adjusting forms, or correcting habits formed from writing 1989. The number felt new for a brief moment, then became routine. People adapted quickly, as they always did, without emotional attachment or sense of transformation. The weather followed its own patterns, indifferent to human timelines. Snow fell in some regions, rain in others. Forecasts predicted temperatures and conditions with familiar accuracy. People dressed accordingly, layering clothing or carrying umbrellas. Seasonal changes mattered more than calendar milestones. The rhythm of nature continued uninterrupted. In factories and warehouses, machines operated on regular schedules. Shifts began and ended with whistles or clocks. Production goals were met gradually. Maintenance checks were performed. The workforce adjusted to minor changes without considering the symbolic significance of the year. Work was work, regardless of the decade. Banks opened their doors at standard hours. Tellers counted cash, transactions were processed, statements were printed and mailed. Financial routines remained steady. People deposited paychecks, paid bills, and balanced accounts. The economy, as experienced by most individuals, moved forward quietly, shaped more by personal circumstance than by the changing of decades. In rural areas, daily life followed long-established patterns. Farms operated on seasonal schedules, equipment was maintained, livestock was cared for. The year 1990 arrived without altering the demands of land or labor. Time was measured in daylight and weather rather than decades. As weeks passed, January settled into February. The initial novelty of writing a new year faded completely. The idea that 1990 marked the beginning of something new became less noticeable with each passing day. Life continued in small, repetitive moments. Days blurred together. Progress was subtle and slow. Looking back, there was little that distinguished the opening of 1990 from the end of 1989 in everyday experience. The transition lacked drama. It offered no immediate transformation. History, if it was happening at all, moved quietly beneath the surface, unnoticed by the most of the people living through it. The decade did not announce itself. It simply arrived, sat down, and waited as Americans continued their routines, unaware that the ordinary days they were living would one day be labeled, analyzed, and remembered as the beginning of the 1990s. And so the year moved forward, one eventful day at a time, without ceremony, without reflection, and without any clear sense that anything new had truly begun.
Mornings, offices, and the continuation of work. Morning in the United States in 1990 began the same way it had for years, without ceremony or reflection. Alarm clocks sounded at predictable times, often with the same buzzing tone people had grown accustomed to ignoring until the last possible moment. Bedrooms filled briefly with the quiet resistance of waking bodies, followed by the slow acceptance that another workday had arrived. There was no sense that anything had changed because the calendar now displayed a different year. Morning routines continued exactly as before. In kitchens across the country, coffee brewed steadily. The sound of water heating and dripping into glass pots was familiar and comforting, not exciting or noteworthy. Breakfasts were simple and repeated: toast, cereal, eggs prepared quickly. Radios played quietly in the background, offering weather reports, traffic updates, and voices that had become part of the daily rhythm. These broadcasts were practical rather than inspiring, providing information that helped people leave their homes on time. Commuting followed established patterns. Cars moved slowly along highways and city streets, often stopping at the same intersections every day. Drivers waited patiently at red lights, eyes fixed forward, hands resting on steering wheels. Some listened to talk radio, others to cassette tapes carefully inserted into dashboards. Public transportation followed schedules printed months earlier. Buses arrived, doors opened, passengers boarded, and routes continued without deviation. Office buildings stood quietly as workers arrived. Most were unremarkable structures made of concrete, glass, or brick, designed for function rather than beauty. Elevators carried people upward floor by floor. Hallways were lined with neutral-colored walls and identical doors. Fluorescent lights turned on automatically, casting an even, shadowless glow over workspaces that looked nearly the same from one building to the next. Inside offices, desks were arranged in rows or clusters. Many were covered with stacks of paper, reports, memos, invoices, and forms waiting to be reviewed or filed. Filing cabinets lined walls, their drawers labeled clearly, holding years of accumulated documents. The sound of drawers opening and closing was constant but unremarkable. Paper moved from one place to another slowly, deliberately, and with little urgency. Early computers occupied many desks, though they did not dominate them. Monitors were large and heavy, displaying simple text or basic graphics. Machines took time to start, producing soft humming noises as they warmed up. Employees typed carefully, saving work frequently out of habit rather than fear. Software performed limited tasks reliably, without innovation or surprise. Computers assisted work, but they did not redefine it. Fax machines were a common presence. They sat in shared spaces, waiting silently until activated. When documents were sent or received, the machines came alive with mechanical sounds, whirring, beeping, and the steady pulling of paper through rollers. Employees gathered briefly to retrieve printed pages, scanning them quickly before returning to their desks. Faxed documents felt important but routine, another step in the slow movement of information. Telephones rang irregularly at irregular intervals. Conversations were brief and practical. Messages were written down on small pads of paper or sticky notes and delivered by hand. Voicemail systems existed but were not always trusted. Communication required patience. Responses took time. Waiting was part of the process and rarely questioned. Meetings filled much of the workday. They were scheduled in advance and followed familiar formats. People gathered around tables or sat in rows of chairs. Agendas were distributed, often printed and stapled. Discussions moved slowly from one topic to the next. Decisions were rarely final. Notes were taken. Follow-up meetings were scheduled. The act of meeting was as important as the outcome, reinforcing the sense of structure and order. Managers spoke calmly, often repeating points to ensure clarity. Employees listened, nodded, and occasionally asked questions. The language used was formal but predictable. Phrases like moving forward, reviewing options, and circling back appeared frequently. Meetings ended without dramatic conclusions, and participants returned to their desks to continue tasks already in progress. Time passed steadily. Clocks on walls marked the hours with quiet ticks.
Lunch breaks arrived at expected times. Some employees brought food from home, stored in office refrigerators and reheated in shared microwaves. Others left buildings to eat at nearby restaurants or cafeterias. Meals were quick and functional, providing energy rather than entertainment. Afternoons mirrored mornings. Work continued without interruption. Papers were reviewed, typed, corrected, and filed. Errors were addressed calmly. Progress was measured in small increments, completed forms, answered calls, updated records. The sense of accomplishment was minimal but sufficient. There was satisfaction in routine rather than achievement. Office culture emphasized consistency. Dress codes were followed without question. Suits, ties, skirts, and modest accessories reflected professionalism rather than personal expression. Cubicles provided privacy while reinforcing uniformity. Decorations were limited to calendars, framed certificates, or family photographs placed discreetly on desks. Technology did not demand attention. Computers waited patiently for input. Printers produced documents slowly and reliably. Copy machines hummed steadily, occasionally jamming and requiring careful adjustment. These interruptions were accepted without frustration. Waiting for machines was part of the workday. As the afternoon progressed, energy levels declined slightly. Coffee was refilled. Lights remained bright. Conversations stayed focused. The end of the day approached gradually, announced not by excitement but by clocks nearing familiar times. Tasks were wrapped up methodically. Files were closed. Desks were straightened. Leaving the office felt routine rather than rewarding. Employees gathered belongings and moved toward exits. Elevators descended slowly. Parking lots filled with cars starting engines almost simultaneously. Traffic patterns repeated themselves. The workday ended, not with celebration, but with quiet acknowledgement. The next morning would be the same. The same alarms, the same commutes, the same desks and machines. In 1990, work did not feel like a chapter in history. It felt like continuity, days stacked upon days, each nearly indistinguishable from the last. Progress happened quietly, if at all. It moved through paperwork, meetings, and machines that performed their tasks without recognition. Most workers did not feel part of something historic. They felt part of a system designed to function steadily, predictably, and without disruption. And so mornings came, offices filled, and work continued, slowly, evenly, and without ceremony, carrying the year forward one ordinary day at a time.
Technology in the United States in 1990 did not announce itself loudly. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not demand immediate attention. Instead, it settled into daily life slowly, taking its place among existing routines without asking to be admired or feared. For most people, technology was something used rather than discussed, something that worked quietly in the background while life continued much as it always had. Personal computers were present in many homes and offices, but they did not dominate space or conversation. They sat on desks, often heavy and box-shaped, with monitors that took time to warm up. Turning them on was a deliberate act. A soft hum followed, then a pause, then a simple screen appeared. Users waited patiently, accustomed to the idea that machines needed time. There was no expectation of speed beyond what had already been accepted. Most computers served specific purposes. They stored documents, managed simple spreadsheets, or ran basic programs. Their screens displayed text more often than images. Colors were limited, graphics were simple. People learned to work within these limitations without complaint. The computer was a tool, not an experience, and its role was clearly defined. Software in 1990 was functional rather than impressive. Programs opened slowly and followed predictable patterns. Menus were simple, commands were memorized through repetition. Updates were rare and usually installed from disks, one at a time,
with careful attention. When software worked, it was appreciated quietly. When it did not, users adapted, restarting systems or waiting for assistance. Landline telephones remained central to communication. They were fixed in place, attached to walls or resting on desks and tables. Their cords curled naturally from years of use. Phones rang with familiar tones, and people answered them without hesitation. Conversations were direct and unrecorded. Messages were written down by hand, often on small slips of paper placed in visible locations. Answering machines played a supporting role. They recorded short messages in mechanical voices, storing them until someone returned home or arrived at work. People listened carefully, sometimes rewinding to catch missed words. Messages were brief and practical. The technology served its purpose without attempting to replace human presence. Fax machines continued to move information steadily. They translated paper into signals and back again, producing physical copies that felt official and tangible. Offices relied on them for contracts, forms, and confirmations. Sending a fax required preparation and patience. Receiving one involved waiting and listening for familiar sounds. The process was slow but dependable. Printers and copy machines worked steadily. They were large, shared devices that required occasional maintenance. Paper trays were refilled, toner cartridges were replaced. When machines jammed, employees responded calmly, opening panels and removing stuck pages with practiced care. These moments were accepted as part of the routine, rather than as disruptions. Technology in homes followed similar patterns. Televisions remained the primary source of entertainment and information. Remote controls were used, but sparingly. Channels were limited, and programming followed schedules rather than personal preference. Viewers adapted their evenings to broadcasts, not the other way around. VCRs allowed for recording and replaying programs, but they required planning. Tapes were labeled carefully, clocks were set manually, mistakes were common and accepted. Rewinding tapes took time. Watching recorded content was an activity that involved waiting and patience. Kitchen appliances continued to operate reliably. Microwaves warmed food, dishwashers cleaned plates. Digital clocks displayed the time, sometimes blinking after power interruptions. These machines blended into daily life without attracting attention. They did not change habits so much as support them. At work, technology supported existing systems rather than replacing them. Computers assisted with tasks that were already familiar. Phone systems improved efficiency slightly. Machines made processes more reliable, but they did not eliminate the need for human judgment or presence. Work remained structured around people, schedules, and paperwork. Learning to use technology was gradual. Manuals were read, instructions were followed step by step. Training sessions were conducted in quiet rooms. Knowledge spread slowly through demonstration and repetition. There was no rush to master new tools, only a steady expectation of competence over time. Maintenance was part of everyday experience. Machines required care. Disks were stored properly. Equipment was turned off at the end of the day. Technology was respected for its function rather than celebrated for its potential. It was expected to work, not to inspire. In public spaces, technology remained unobtrusive. Automated systems existed, but human interaction was still common. Clerks operated registers. Operators connected calls. Information was requested in person or over the phone. Technology assisted these interactions without replacing them. The presence of technology did not redefine identity. People did not think of themselves as users or early adopters. They thought of themselves as workers, parents, students, or neighbors. Technology was simply one part of the environment, like furniture or lighting. Changes happened slowly.
New machines replaced old ones over time. People adjusted without resistance or excitement. There was no sense of living through a technological revolution. Instead, there was a feeling of continuity, of small improvements layered onto familiar systems. Looking back, it might appear that technology in 1990 was preparing the ground for dramatic change, but at the time it felt stable and predictable. Machines did not promise transformation, they offered assistance, reliability, and routine. Days passed with technology performing its tasks quietly. Computers saved files, phones rang, faxes printed, printers hummed. Each action was small and repeatable. Progress, if it existed, was subtle and unremarked. Technology did not hurry people. It did not demand attention. It waited to be used and then returned to silence. Life continued around it, shaped more by habits than by innovation. And so, in 1990, technology entered daily life without drama, without excitement, and without disruption, settling into place as another steady presence in a world that preferred things to move slowly.
News that repeated itself day after day. In 1990, the news in the United States followed a rhythm that was steady, predictable, and rarely surprising. It arrived at the same times each day, spoken in familiar voices, printed in familiar layouts, and framed in language that had already been used many times before. For most Americans, the news was not something that interrupted daily life. It was something that accompanied it quietly, like background sound or routine weather. Morning newspapers landed on doorsteps before sunrise. They were folded neatly, wrapped in thin plastic on rainy days, and left in the same places every morning. People picked them up on their way inside, often without opening them immediately. The paper rested on kitchen tables or counters, waiting patiently while coffee brewed and breakfast was prepared. When newspapers were finally opened, the experience was familiar. Headlines appeared in large, dark letters. Subheadings explained details calmly. Articles followed a structure readers already understood. There was no urgency in the design. Information was laid out methodically, column by column, page by page. Most readers did not read every word. They scanned, they skimmed. Eyes moved down pages, stopping briefly on topics that seemed relevant or recognizable. Many stories felt like continuations of stories from the day before. The language was careful and restrained. Nothing demanded immediate action. Political news appeared regularly and predictably. Names of officials were repeated often enough that readers no longer paused to consider them. Statements were quoted. Responses were analyzed. Discussions of policy moved slowly, explained in measured tones. There was little sense of drama in the way information was presented. International news occupied its usual space. Ongoing situations were described with maps and formal language. Events overseas were framed as developments rather than turning points. Readers learned about places they might never visit through articles that changed only slightly from day to day. Progress, setbacks, negotiations, and statements followed one another without resolution. In the evenings, television news took over. Families turned on their televisions at familiar hours, often while preparing or eating dinner. The news programs began with music that viewers recognized immediately. Anchors appeared behind desks, dressed formally, speaking clearly and calmly. The structure of broadcasts was consistent. Headlines were introduced, then explained in greater detail. Footage played quietly. Correspondents spoke from locations that had appeared many times before. The tone remained controlled and professional.
Emotional reactions were rare and understated. Weather reports followed predictable patterns. Maps appeared on screens. Temperatures were explained. Forecasts were delivered without exaggeration. Viewers adjusted plans slightly, perhaps choosing a jacket or umbrella, but rarely felt surprised. Commercial breaks interrupted broadcasts at regular intervals. Advertisements repeated familiar messages about products people already knew. These breaks provided time to refill drinks or clear plates. When the news returned, it picked up where it left off, unchanged. The language of the news was steady and formal. Phrases repeated themselves across broadcasts and publications. Words like developing, ongoing, and officials say appeared frequently. This repetition created a sense of continuity rather than urgency. Most Americans absorbed the news passively. They listened while doing other things. They read while distracted. The information entered their awareness gradually, without demand. Few people discussed the details at length. The news informed, but it did not excite. Radio news followed similar patterns. Short updates were delivered between songs or talk segments. Voices spoke quickly but calmly. Headlines were summarized. Time limits kept coverage brief. Listeners nodded, acknowledged the information, and continued driving or working. The repetition of news created familiarity. Stories unfolded slowly, sometimes over weeks or months. Each update added small details, but rarely changed the overall understanding. The sense of waiting became normal. Even significant events were framed cautiously. Broadcasters avoided speculation. Newspapers emphasized verification. The tone remained measured. Readers and viewers learned to expect consistency rather than surprise. Local news added another layer of repetition. City councils met regularly. School boards discussed budgets. Traffic reports followed the same routes. Crime stories appeared briefly, then faded. The local news reflected daily life rather than historical moments. Sports news followed seasons and schedules. Scores were reported, standings were updated. Commentary remained restrained. Fans followed teams out of habit rather than excitement. The news cycle moved forward steadily. One day followed another. Yesterday's headlines became today's background. Tomorrow promised similar information delivered in the same way. People trusted the rhythm. They expected the news to be there, unchanged in format and tone. It provided reassurance through consistency. The absence of urgency was comforting. In offices, newspapers were folded and placed aside. Televisions in break rooms played quietly. The news became part of the workday's background noise. Conversations referenced headlines briefly, without depth. At home, the evening news marked time. It signaled the transition from day to night. After it ended, regular programming resumed. The day continued. There was little sense that history was unfolding rapidly. The news suggested continuity rather than change. Events seemed managed, contained, and explained. Looking back, it might appear that important things were happening, but at the time, the repetition softened their impact. Each update felt small. Each day felt similar. The news did not rush anyone. It did not demand immediate understanding. It arrived, delivered information, and moved on. And so, in 1990, newspapers were printed, broadcasts were aired, and information was shared calmly, day after day, repeating itself quietly as Americans absorbed it without urgency, letting it fade gently into the background of ordinary life.
Suburban evenings and predictable leisure. In 1990, suburban evenings in the United States arrived quietly and without announcement. They did not rush in or demand attention. Instead,
They settled gently over neighborhoods as daylight faded and routines took over. For many people, the end of the workday did not signal excitement or anticipation. It marked a return to familiar patterns that had been repeated many times before and would continue unchanged for years. Cars moved steadily through residential streets at the same hours each evening. Driveways filled slowly as people arrived home one by one. Engines were turned off, doors closed softly. The sound of movement gradually gave way to stillness. Sidewalks remained mostly empty, and front lawns looked the same as they had earlier in the day, unchanged by the passing of time. Inside homes, lights were turned on room by room. Kitchens became the center of activity, not because of creativity or celebration, but because dinner needed to be prepared. Meals followed predictable schedules. Recipes were familiar. Ingredients were already known. Cooking was done efficiently, without experimentation. The goal was nourishment rather than enjoyment. Family dinners were calm and routine. Plates were placed on tables. Chairs were pulled out and pushed back in. Conversations were brief and practical, often centered on schedules, errands, or minor observations from the day. There was no urgency to speak at length. Silence was common and accepted. Eating was part of the routine, not an event. After dinner, dishes were cleared and washed. Dishwashers hummed steadily. Counters were wiped clean. Kitchens returned to order. These tasks were done without thought, guided by habit rather than intention. The evening moved forward without pause. Television sets were turned on at familiar times. The sound filled living rooms softly, providing background noise more than entertainment. Television schedules were fixed and known. Viewers rarely questioned what was on. They accepted it as part of the evening structure. Programs began and ended at predictable intervals. Sitcoms followed established formats. Characters appeared in familiar settings. Laugh tracks played at expected moments. Episodes resolved conflicts gently and without lasting consequences. Viewers watched without deep engagement, often distracted by other activities or drifting thoughts. News programs appeared at the same hour every night. Anchors spoke calmly. Stories repeated information already known. Weather forecasts were reviewed again. The broadcast served as a marker of time rather than a source of urgency. Commercials interrupted programs regularly. Advertisements repeated messages that viewers had already seen many times. Products were familiar. Claims were modest. The repetition blended into the background, becoming part of the evening rhythm. Some evenings included grocery shopping. Stores were well lit and orderly. Shoppers moved slowly through aisles, selecting items from lists that rarely changed. The same brands were chosen repeatedly. Checkout lines moved at steady speeds. Receipts were printed and folded. Groceries were loaded into cars and carried into homes without ceremony. Neighborhoods grew quieter as the evening progressed. Streetlights turned on automatically. The glow reflected softly on sidewalks and parked cars. Houses appeared calm and contained, each one holding similar routines behind closed doors. Children completed homework at kitchen tables or desks. Pages were filled in. Assignments were completed without enthusiasm. Parents checked work briefly. The process was orderly and predictable. Education continued quietly into the evening hours. Some families took short walks after dinner. The streets were calm. Greetings were exchanged briefly between neighbors. There were no long conversations. People returned home quickly, satisfied with the small movement before settling in again. Leisure activities were limited and repetitive. Reading involved familiar books or magazines. Pages were turned slowly. Articles were skimmed rather than studied. The goal was relaxation, not discovery. Hobbies existed, but they were modest. Small projects were worked on briefly. Tools were put away carefully. Progress was slow and often unmeasured. Satisfaction came from the act itself rather than the result. Phones rang occasionally. Calls were answered politely. Conversations were short and purposeful. Messages were exchanged. Plans were confirmed. Calls ended without lingering emotion. As the night continued, energy levels declined. Yawns became common. Television volume was lowered. Programs were watched passively. Some people fell asleep on couches without noticing when it happened. Bedtime routines followed familiar patterns. Lights were turned off in specific orders. Doors were checked. Alarm clocks were set. Bedrooms grew quiet. The day ended without reflection or summary. Outside, neighborhoods rested. Traffic disappeared. Sounds became minimal. The suburban landscape remained still and unchanged, waiting for morning. There were no memorable events in most evenings. Nothing demanded attention or explanation. The absence of excitement was normal. Comfort came from predictability. Entertainment did not surprise. Leisure did not challenge. Evenings passed gently, shaped by schedules rather than choices. Looking back, these nights would blend together, indistinguishable from one another. At the time, they felt endless and stable. There was no awareness that these ordinary evenings would someday be remembered as part of a specific era. In 1990, suburban evenings did not attempt to be meaningful. They existed to fill time between days of work. They provided rest through repetition. And so, night after night, televisions glowed, dinners were eaten, groceries were stored, and neighborhoods remained quiet, each evening passing calmly, predictably, and without leaving a mark, as leisure followed fixed routines and time moved forward without interruption.
The economy as a background presence. In 1990, the economy in the United States existed mostly in the background of everyday life. It was present in conversations, mentioned in passing, and reported regularly, but it rarely felt immediate or urgent to most households. For many people, the economy was something that was talked about rather than experienced directly, something that moved quietly beneath routines that stayed largely the same from day to day. Economic discussions appeared often in newspapers and on television, framed in careful language and supported by numbers that changed slowly. Terms like growth, slowdown, inflation, and employment were repeated with consistency. These words became familiar, even if their meanings were not always fully examined. Listeners heard them often enough that they blended into the larger stream of information that passed through daily life. Prices were noticed most clearly in small, practical moments. Grocery shopping revealed gradual changes. Some items cost slightly more than before. Others stayed the same. These changes were rarely dramatic. Shoppers adjusted without comment, choosing familiar brands, substituting one product for another, or simply paying the new amount without reflection. Receipts were folded and placed in wallets or purses, reviewed briefly, and then forgotten. Gas prices were observed from behind steering wheels as drivers passed station signs. The numbers mattered, but only briefly. Drivers filled their tanks, paid, and continued on their way. The cost of fuel was noted, perhaps mentioned once in conversation, and then absorbed into the overall cost of living without much thought. Employment concerns existed, but they moved slowly. People talked about job security in general terms rather than personal crises. News reports discussed hiring trends and layoffs, but these stories often felt distant, affecting unnamed individuals in other places. For those who remained employed, work continued with little visible change. Paychecks arrived on schedule, taxes were deducted, the rhythm of earning and spending remained intact. In offices and workplaces, economic conditions were discussed cautiously.
Managers used measured language, plans were reviewed, budgets were adjusted slightly. These discussions happened behind closed doors or in meetings that did not lead to immediate changes for most employees. The economy influenced decisions, but its presence was indirect and gradual. Household finances were managed with routine attention. Bills arrived by mail and were paid on time. Mortgage payments, rent, utilities, and insurance followed established schedules. Families balanced checkbooks carefully, recording amounts by hand or with simple tools. The process was steady and repetitive, offering a sense of control, even as larger economic forces remained abstract. Financial news occupied a regular place in broadcasts. Anchors reported market movements calmly. Numbers scrolled across screens. Analysts explained trends in composed voices. For most viewers, this information was acknowledged but not acted upon. The stock market existed as a distant system, relevant primarily to professionals and investors rather than everyday routines. Interest rates were mentioned often, but their impact was subtle. They influenced loans, mortgages, and savings gradually. Changes were discussed, explained, and then accepted. Few people adjusted their behavior immediately. Life continued according to established plans. Savings accounts grew slowly. Statements arrived in the mail, listing balances and small amounts of interest earned. These documents were reviewed briefly and filed away. Financial progress was measured in months and years rather than days. Conversations about the economy occurred in predictable settings. They took place at work, over dinner, or during casual gatherings. The tone was usually neutral. People expressed mild concern or cautious optimism without strong emotion. There was little sense of urgency, only an awareness that economic conditions existed and mattered in a general way. Retail environments reflected this steady pace. Stores remained stocked, sales appeared regularly, shoppers responded to discounts but did not change habits drastically. Spending was careful but consistent. Consumption followed patterns rather than impulses. In media, economic stories followed familiar formats. Reports compared current conditions to previous months or years. Charts showed gradual movement. Explanations emphasized continuity rather than disruption. The economy was framed as something that changed slowly and required patience to understand. For many households, the most direct experience of the economy came through routine decisions, whether to make a purchase now or later, whether to save or spend, whether to adjust plans slightly. These decisions were made quietly and individually, without dramatic consequences. Economic uncertainty existed, but it was managed through habit. People relied on routines to provide stability. Regular schedules, steady employment, and familiar expenses created a sense of order that softened abstract concerns. Time passed without clear markers. One month followed another. Financial conditions were reviewed periodically rather than constantly. The economy moved forward, but it did so quietly, without demanding attention. Even moments of concern were understated. Warnings were issued carefully. Advice was offered calmly. The tone remained composed. Panic was avoided through repetition and reassurance. Looking back, it might seem that economic forces were shaping the decade. But at the time, these forces felt distant. They were discussed more often than they were felt. Life continued at the level of individual households, guided by routines rather than economic theory. The economy remained present but unobtrusive. It existed as context rather than experience. People acknowledged it, adjusted slightly, and moved on. In 1990, the economy did not interrupt daily life. It accompanied it quietly, influencing decisions slowly and indirectly. Most households experienced it not as a series of events, but as a steady background condition, always there, rarely urgent, and seldom noticed beyond the small details of ordinary living. And so days passed, bills were paid, Prices were noted and conversations continued, while the economy remained in the background, shaping life gently and gradually without drawing attention to itself.
Culture that changed so gradually it was barely noticed. At the start of the 1990s, culture in the United States did not shift suddenly or announce itself with clarity. It did not arrive as a clear break from what had come before. Instead, it moved slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly, blending into existing habits and preferences without demanding attention. For most people living through it, cultural change was something that happened in the background, unfolding gently over time rather than appearing as a defining moment. Music continued to play on radios, cassette players, and home stereos much as it had before. Stations followed established formats. DJs spoke in familiar tones, introducing songs that sounded comfortably recognizable. New music entered playlists gradually, often mixed with songs that had already been popular for years. There was no sense that something entirely new had arrived. Instead, listeners heard variations on sounds they already knew. Albums were purchased in record stores that looked much the same as they had in the previous decade. Shelves were organized by genre. Customers browsed slowly, flipping through cases one by one. Choices were made carefully. Music was taken home, unwrapped, and played repeatedly. Songs became familiar through repetition rather than novelty. Fashion followed a similar pattern of gradual adjustment. Clothing styles shifted slightly, but nothing changed overnight. People wore what they already owned, replacing items only when necessary. Colors, fabrics, and cuts evolved slowly, influenced by availability more than intention. There was no widespread sense of adopting a new look. Most people dressed for comfort, work, or routine activities rather than expression. Department stores displayed seasonal collections that differed only subtly from the year before. Mannequins wore outfits that suggested change without insisting on it. Shoppers noticed small differences but rarely discussed them. Purchases were practical. Wardrobes evolved quietly. Media reflected this steady pace. Television programming continued with familiar formats. Shows introduced new characters or settings gradually. Networks adjusted schedules slightly, but viewers adapted easily. There was no disruption to viewing habits. The television remained a consistent presence, offering continuity rather than innovation. Movies followed established storytelling patterns. Theaters screened films that felt similar in tone and structure to those of the late 1980s. Audiences attended out of habit. The experience of going to the movies remained unchanged. Tickets purchased, seats chosen, light dimmed. Cultural consumption followed routine. Print media continued to shape awareness subtly. Magazines featured articles on lifestyle, entertainment, and trends, but their tone remained restrained. Features described changes cautiously. Readers absorbed information slowly, often without connecting it to larger shifts. Language evolved gently. New terms appeared occasionally, but they were adopted gradually. Most conversations used familiar expressions. Changes in speech patterns happened over time, unnoticed by those using them daily. Technology influenced culture indirectly. Music formats, media distribution, and communication tools supported existing habits rather than replacing them. People listened, watched, and read in ways that felt familiar. Cultural content reached audiences through channels they already trusted. Youth culture existed, but it did not dominate daily life. Trends emerged among specific groups and took time to spread. Older generations observed changes without concern. Younger people adopted styles and sounds gradually, often unaware that they were participating in something new. Workplace culture remained formal and consistent. Dress codes reflected professionalism. Media consumption at work was limited. Cultural change did not disrupt routines. It adjusted quietly around them.
Advertising reflected this subdued tone. Commercials suggested new ideas without insisting on them. Products were marketed as improvements rather than transformations. The message was reassurance rather than excitement. Music videos played on television at scheduled times. Viewers watched casually. Visual styles evolved slowly. Nothing demanded interpretation. Entertainment filled time rather than redefining it. Public spaces reflected continuity. Posters, signs, and displays changed occasionally, but the overall environment remained stable. Cultural signals were subtle and easily overlooked. Conversations about culture were brief and informal. People mentioned songs, shows, or styles without analysis. Preferences were personal. There was no sense of participating in a cultural shift. Time passed quietly. Seasons changed. Media cycles continued. What was new gradually became familiar. Cultural elements blended into everyday life without distinction. Looking back, it might appear that the early 1990s marked important cultural movements, but at the time these movements felt indistinct. They did not demand recognition. They unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. Most people did not feel that culture was changing. They felt that life was continuing. Habits persisted. Routines remained intact. The idea of a new cultural era did not shape daily awareness. Music played, clothes were worn, shows were watched, magazines were read. Each action felt ordinary. Cultural change occurred through accumulation rather than announcement. The lack of urgency made the transition smooth. Nothing needed to be learned quickly, nothing needed to be replaced. Familiarity provided comfort. Culture moved forward without interruption. It adjusted quietly to new influences while preserving old ones. The balance remained steady. In 1990, culture did not feel revolutionary. It felt stable. It felt familiar. It felt like continuity. And so, music, fashion, and media continued to evolve slowly, blending with what already existed, changing just enough to move forward while remaining largely unnoticed, passing gently through daily life, one ordinary moment at a time.
Culture that changed so gradually it was barely noticed. At the start of the 1990s, culture in the United States did not shift suddenly or announce itself with clarity. It did not arrive as a clear break from what had come before. Instead, it moved slowly, quietly, and almost invisibly, blending into existing habits and preferences without demanding attention. For most people living through it, cultural change was something that happened in the background, unfolding gently over time rather than appearing as a defining moment. Music continued to play on radios, cassette players, and home stereos, much as it had before. Stations followed established formats. DJs spoke in familiar tones, introducing songs that sounded comfortably recognizable. New music entered playlists gradually, often mixed with songs that had already been popular for years. There was no sense that something entirely new had arrived. Instead, listeners heard variations on sounds they already knew. Albums were purchased in record stores that looked much the same as they had in the previous decade. Shelves were organized by genre. Customers browsed slowly, flipping through cases one by one. Choices were made carefully. Music was taken home, unwrapped, and played repeatedly. Songs became familiar through repetition rather than novelty. Fashion followed a similar pattern of gradual adjustment. Clothing styles shifted slightly, but nothing changed overnight. People wore what they already owned, replacing items only when necessary. Colors, fabrics, and cuts evolved slowly, influenced by availability more than intention. There was no widespread sense of adopting a new look. Most people dressed for comfort, work, or routine activities rather than expression. Department stores displayed seasonal collections that differed only subtly from the year before.
Mannequins wore outfits that suggested change without insisting on it. Shoppers noticed small differences but rarely discussed them. Purchases were practical. Wardrobes evolved quietly. Media reflected this steady pace. Television programming continued with familiar formats. Shows introduced new characters or settings gradually. Networks adjusted schedules slightly, but viewers adapted easily. There was no disruption to viewing habits. The television remained a consistent presence, offering continuity rather than innovation. Movies followed established storytelling patterns. Theaters screened films that felt similar in tone and structure to those of the late 1980s. Audiences attended out of habit. The experience of going to the movies remained unchanged. Tickets purchased, seats chosen, lights dimmed. Cultural consumption followed routine. Print media continued to shape awareness subtly. Magazines featured articles on lifestyle, entertainment, and trends, but their tone remained restrained. Features described changes cautiously. Readers absorbed information slowly, often without connecting it to larger shifts. Language evolved gently. New terms appeared occasionally, but they were adopted gradually. Most conversations used familiar expressions. Changes in speech patterns happened over time, unnoticed by those using them daily. Technology influenced culture indirectly. Music formats, media distribution, and communication tools supported existing habits rather than replacing them. People listened, watched, and read in ways that felt familiar. Cultural content reached audiences through channels they already trusted. Youth culture existed, but it did not dominate daily life. Trends emerged among specific groups and took time to spread. Older generations observed changes without concern. Younger people adopted styles and sounds gradually, often unaware that they were participating in something new. Workplace culture remained formal and consistent. Dress codes reflected professionalism. Media consumption at work was limited. Cultural change did not disrupt routines. It adjusted quietly around them. Advertising reflected this same subdued tone. Commercials suggested new ideas without insisting on them. Products were marketed as improvements rather than transformations. The message was reassurance rather than excitement. Music videos played on television at scheduled times. Viewers watched casually. Visual styles evolved slowly. Nothing demanded interpretation. Entertainment filled time rather than redefining it. Public spaces reflected continuity. Posters, signs, and displays changed occasionally, but the overall environment remained stable. Cultural signals were subtle and easily overlooked. Conversations about culture were brief and informal. People mentioned songs, shows, or styles without analysis. Preferences were personal. There was no sense of participating in a cultural shift. Time passed quietly. Seasons changed. Media cycles continued. What was new gradually became familiar. Cultural elements blended into everyday life without distinction. Looking back, it might appear that the early 1990s marked the beginning of important cultural movements, but at the time, these movements felt indistinct. They did not demand recognition. They unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. Most people did not feel that culture was changing. They felt that life was continuing. Habits persisted. Routines remained intact. The idea of a new cultural era did not shape daily awareness. Music played, clothes were worn, shows were watched, magazines were read. Each action felt ordinary. Cultural change occurred through accumulation rather than announcement. The lack of urgency made the transition smooth. Nothing needed to be learned quickly. Nothing needed to be replaced. Familiarity provided comfort. Culture moved forward without interruption. It adjusted quietly to new influences while preserving old ones. The balance remained steady. In 1990, culture did not feel revolutionary. It felt stable. It felt familiar. It felt like continuity. And so, music, fashion, and media continued to evolve slowly, blending with what already existed, changing just enough to move forward while remaining largely unnoticed, passing gently through daily life, one ordinary moment at a time.
Ordinary people moving through ordinary days.
In 1990, most Americans moved through their days without any sense that history was unfolding around them. Life was experienced not as a sequence of meaningful moments, but as a steady flow of routines that repeated themselves with only minor variation. People did not wake up thinking about the decade or the direction of the country. They woke up because alarm clocks sounded, because responsibilities waited, and because yesterday's schedule continued into today. Mornings began quietly, bedrooms filled with soft light or darkness depending on the season. People sat up slowly, adjusted blankets, and reached for clocks to turn off alarms. There was no urgency in these movements, only habit. Getting out of bed was something learned over many years, practiced daily, and rarely questioned. Bathrooms filled with familiar sounds, running water, toothbrushes against teeth, mirrors fogging briefly and then clearing again. These actions required little thought. They were performed automatically, guided by memory rather than intention. The day began before anyone considered what the day might mean. Breakfast was simple. Some people ate at kitchen tables, others standing near counters. Coffee was poured into the same mugs used every morning. Cereal boxes were opened and closed. The process was efficient and predictable. Nutrition mattered more than enjoyment. The goal was readiness, not reflection. Leaving home followed an established order. Keys were picked up from familiar places, doors were locked, cars were started. The sound of engines filled driveways and parking lots. People drove the same routes they had driven many times before, stopping at the same intersections, waiting at the same traffic lights. Commuting was rarely memorable. Time passed slowly but steadily. Drivers watched the road ahead, adjusted speed, and listened to radios or sat in silence. Public transportation carried passengers who stood or sat quietly, holding on to rails or reading newspapers. Faces were neutral. Everyone was moving somewhere, but no one felt rushed by history. Workdays unfolded in predictable patterns. Tasks were completed one after another. Conversations were polite and brief. Lunch breaks arrived on schedule. The details of work varied, but the structure remained the same. Progress was measured in completed assignments rather than accomplishments. Errands filled the spaces between obligations. Grocery stores, post offices, banks, and pharmacies were visited regularly. People waited in lines without complaint. Time spent waiting was accepted as part of daily life. The line moved slowly, person by person, transaction by transaction. Shopping lists guided decisions. Items were chosen from shelves, prices were noted briefly, purchases were made without excitement. Bags were carried to cars and then into homes. Groceries were unpacked and stored in familiar places. Waiting became a normal condition. Waiting for appointments, waiting for services, waiting for others to finish speaking or moving. Waiting was rarely discussed. It simply happened, filling minutes and hours without consequence. Conversations with strangers were brief and practical. Greetings were exchanged, instructions were given, receipts were handed over. Interactions ended politely and without memory. Most people did not expect these moments to be meaningful. Afternoons passed quietly. Energy levels shifted slightly. Tasks were finished. New tasks replaced them. The day moved forward at a steady pace, guided by clocks rather than emotions. Evenings brought a return home. Commutes reversed direction, cars filled the same roads, houses welcomed people back with familiar rooms and routines. Dinner was prepared and eaten. The details varied little from one day to the next. Preparation for tomorrow began almost immediately. Clothes were set out, lunches were packed, schedules were reviewed briefly. These preparations were small but important, ensuring that the next day would unfold smoothly. Televisions were turned on, newspapers were folded, radios played quietly. Information and entertainment blended into background noise. Attention drifted. There was no need to focus closely. Personal time was unstructured. Some people read, others rested. Some simply sat quietly. These moments were not planned. They filled the space between obligations. As night approached, tiredness became noticeable. Lights were dimmed, activities slowed. Bedtime routines followed established patterns. Teeth were brushed, doors were locked, alarm clocks were set again. Thoughts before sleep were rarely historical. People thought about schedules, tasks, and small concerns. The idea of living through a particular era did not shape their thinking. They were living through a day, and that was enough. Outside, neighborhoods grew quiet. Streets emptied, houses settled into stillness. The world paused briefly before beginning again in the morning. Days blended together. One followed another without distinction. Memory grouped them into weeks and months rather than moments. Change happened slowly, almost invisibly. Most people did not feel that their lives were part of something larger. They felt individual, routine, and ordinary. History existed elsewhere, written by others, happening in places not immediately visible. Yet these ordinary days filled the year. They made up the experience of 1990 for millions of people. The routines, the waiting, the errands, and the preparations formed the texture of daily life. There was comfort in repetition. Familiarity reduced uncertainty. Knowing what came next made life manageable. The absence of excitement was not a problem. It was stability. Time moved forward quietly. Days ended and began again. The future was prepared for, one small step at a time. And so ordinary people continued moving through ordinary days, going to work, running errands, waiting patiently, commuting without reflection, and preparing for tomorrow. Lives shaped not by historic awareness, but by the steady, dependable rhythm of routine.
The year continuing without a clear ending. The year 1990 passed quietly in the United States. Days followed days with little distinction, and weeks drifted into months with only minor shifts in weather, schedules, or routine events. There was no sudden announcement, no moment of reflection, and no point at which anyone could say that the year had ended or that history had reached a conclusion. Instead, time flowed steadily, almost imperceptibly, carrying the country forward without ceremony. Winter faded slowly into spring. The temperature rose gradually. Snow melted into streets and lawns, leaving only traces of moisture. Trees began to bud, and grass grew quietly. People noticed these changes in passing, adjusting clothing, commuting habits, and outdoor activities without fanfare. The rhythm of the year continued without signaling any larger meaning. Days were measured by the repetition of familiar schedules. Work continued according to long-standing routines. Offices opened and closed at the same hours. Meetings occurred in predictable patterns. Paperwork moved from desk to desk. Employees arrived and departed without pause. The routines were steady, almost automatic.
forming a background against which the year progressed. News arrived daily, but rarely disrupted the ordinary flow of life. Newspapers, television broadcasts, and radio reports delivered information calmly. Stories repeated themselves or evolved slowly. Economic updates, political announcements, weather reports, and cultural news appeared in the same measured tones. Readers and viewers absorbed these updates as part of the ongoing background of their days, without urgency or reflection. Even major events, when they occurred, blended into daily life without abrupt attention. People learned of changes in policies, technological introductions, or international developments with casual acknowledgement. These events were noted, perhaps mentioned briefly in conversation, and then life returned to its normal pace. There was no dramatic sense of historical significance at the moment, only a sense of continuity. The rhythms of family life mirrored the pace of the wider world. Morning routines followed similar patterns as before. Breakfasts were prepared and eaten. Children left for school. Adults departed for work. Evenings brought return, dinner, and leisure activities that were quiet and familiar. Television shows aired, radios hummed, and newspapers rested on tables or counters, waiting to be read again. Days flowed smoothly into evenings and nights, one after another. Weather continued to mark the passage of time, but it did so without ceremony. Rain fell steadily on some days, sun shone gently on others, and clouds drifted without dramatic interruption. Seasons changed gradually. People adjusted their routines accordingly. Coats were added or removed, outdoor activities timed differently, commutes slightly modified, but these adjustments were small and incremental. The world moved forward without declaration or summary. Workplaces remained stable. Employees continued their assigned tasks. Computers hummed at desks. Fax machines and printers performed their functions reliably. Meetings happened as scheduled. Progress was measured in the completion of paperwork or minor achievements rather than in grand conclusions. Time passed slowly in offices and factories alike, without anyone pausing to mark the end of the year or reflect on its meaning. Retail and commerce carried on. Stores stocked shelves, transactions occurred, and goods were exchanged predictably. Shoppers made purchases based on lists, needs, or routine decisions. Sales were noticed but did not provoke excitement. The flow of goods and services continued uninterrupted, quietly supporting the rhythm of daily life. Prices changed incrementally, influencing spending decisions subtly and gradually. Cultural life continued without obvious milestones. Music played on radios, cassette tapes, and early CD players. Television schedules rotated familiar shows with small adjustments. Movies released slowly, but most viewers watched them without the sense of witnessing a turning point in culture. Fashion shifted in subtle ways. Trends emerged gradually, layered upon familiar patterns rather than replacing them suddenly. Media and entertainment remained present without marking the year as distinct or concluded. Transportation moved at an unvarying pace. Commuters drove familiar routes, while trains and buses followed established timetables. Traffic patterns fluctuated only slightly with minor changes in population density, construction, or weather. Movement across the country proceeded as expected, quietly shaping the experience of the year without dramatic interruption. Conversations, too, reflected the steadiness of time. People discussed work, family, weather, errands, or minor personal events.
Mentions of larger news stories occurred, but were usually fleeting. Most exchanges were practical, not reflective. There was little sense of contemplating history, and discussions about the year as a whole were rare. The passing of time was felt more than it was analyzed. Government operations continued steadily. Policies were reviewed, legislation moved slowly through committees, and administrative tasks were executed with careful attention. Public announcements occurred as scheduled, and services functioned reliably. Changes in governance were incremental, experienced indirectly by households through small adjustments to routine procedures rather than immediate or dramatic shifts. The year progressed without political fanfare or grand conclusions. Economic conditions remained part of daily awareness, but not central to thought. Inflation, employment figures, and market trends were discussed in newspapers, on television, and among acquaintances, yet the effects were felt gradually rather than suddenly. Households budgeted, saved, and spent according to familiar patterns. Financial life moved in steady increments, quietly shaping personal decisions without dramatic disruption. Even ordinary leisure remained consistent. People walked in neighborhoods, visited parks, played games, or read books. Leisure followed patterns established long ago. Television shows were watched, newspapers read, conversations held, and hobbies practiced. These activities unfolded without marking the year with significance. Life continued gently, one day at a time. Time itself seemed to carry the year forward. Days succeeded one another. Weeks formed months. Months formed seasons. The calendar marked dates, but the turning of pages did not announce completion. Holidays came and went, celebrated with familiar rituals and routines. Each day ended quietly, and the next one began without fanfare. Looking back from later years, 1990 may appear to have been a point of transition, yet at the time the year existed only as an ongoing flow of days. People moved through morning, afternoon, and evening, repeating patterns they had established over decades. The passage of time was steady, unremarkable, and largely unnoticed. Sleep came each night without reflection. Bedtime routines were followed in quiet homes. Rooms darkened, doors closed, and clocks ticked softly. The world rested briefly before beginning again the following morning. Time carried forward without ceremony, and the year continued to exist as part of that unbroken rhythm. In schools, students moved through lessons, completed assignments, and participated in activities that were familiar and predictable. Teachers' repeated instructions and grading schedules remained consistent. Academic life, like all other routines, continued as a steady presence, marking days without drawing attention to the year itself. Even small personal events blended into the larger continuum. Birthdays were celebrated quietly. Errands were run on schedule. Meals were prepared and consumed. Conversations occurred, but their content rarely referenced the year as a whole. Daily life moved forward without reflection on temporal